presenter is Angela Ballard, who is talking about disrupting complexity in planning.
Is that
Very interesting. That's the one going forward? This one. Forward. Yes. Okay. Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. What? We can't get one on? No? Yes, it's on my hand.
Okay. I've really enjoyed listening to your presentations because there's a real sense of, I don't know, what I'm about to talk to you about. There's little bits of all of you in your presentation. And so I'm feeling sort of really blessed that I've gotten to hear all your work first. And so in a sense this is a reflections on your own work. I might just start off with a very brief give you some context. A few years ago I started a research project called the Renters at Home project, and what I was wanting to investigate was the social complexity of the rental system. The reason for that was that we'd had a big austerity measure in our government, and they'd cut all the advocacy for tenants, and it was all a bit of a dramatic scenario for renters in my state of Queensland. And I was one of the 20,000 public servants who got booted out of their job, and I had not much better to do than do this. So I thought I'd take up an action research project using methods that I'd learned as a public servant through the auspices of my organisation and through Dave Snowden, whose name will become more familiar. And so this PhD has been about trialling his methodological approach, which includes some pretty fancy software that integrates modelling and narrative and qualitative stuff, to apply that to the social complexity of the rental system. The purpose, though, because this is action research, is always about change. So it's not just a theoretical exercise. This is gathering data, exploring that data, working with participatory processes with people from the system, i.e. renters and advocates and policymakers, to then take some issues from the data and play with that to find some plans to make some change, to hopefully make life better for renters. So that's the backstory. So I've just told you the story in a context from the context, and why the rental system, and it was a social complexity needing intervention. So my own background is policy advocacy, campaigning, radical adult education, education for social change, and so that's kind of, my own subjectivity zone here, loud and centre, and I'm very transparent about that. This gives you the broad kind of basic core assemblage. So it's based in a loose participatory action research used as principles and structural elements. Snowden's work, and I'll explain a little bit more about that momentarily in terms of its theoretical base, but it's complexity principles with cognitive science and narrative, and supported by the architecture of the SenseMaker software, and that's kind of where a lot of the magic happens. Although the participatory processes, you can manage a lot without going and using the expensive software. But it's the software that gives you the multi-scalar. It gives you the capacity to use that system to do iterative evaluations over time, to see exactly if your interventions are having any sort of impact. The key architecture within SenseMaker is the signification framework. In this case, it's based on the abstract values and concepts from the field of inquiry. So as action research, I went out and did a big kind of broadcast out to the networks to say, I'm doing this, what do you want to know about? What's missing in rental tenancy data? one really key idea was that no one really knows what happens in the 5 years between censuses. So they wanted to know, how many times people are having to move every 5 years. And we'll see the signification framework a little bit later on. But the idea is to mass capture self-signified micro-narratives. So these aren't long stories, these are just fragments. And then we use those patterns that emerge through the software for some collaborative sense making. And we also then use the narratives through other processes with participants to triangulate that data in a sense. Okay, so it's participatory action research, which has its own long history, going back 100 years or so really, although it didn't get named as action research until probably after World War II, with a guy called Kurt Lewin. The co-evolution I've been playing with for the last 4 years really is between participatory action research and planning theory. And there's some interesting pieces of common genealogies that PAR and adult education picked up and ran with that planning kind of left on the roadside. It's also about cognition, heuristics specifically. There's a reason for that, but I won't go into that right now. It's naturalistic decision making, and that comes from Gary Klein. Klein and Kahneman have had an interesting adversarial kind of relationship over the years, but they've actually done some work together, which has been very productive. And then this notion of narrative, as I said, micro-narrative fragments. So it's water cooler anecdotes. It's the sort of stuff that, you'll just hear very quickly. It's as I said, it's not big story. And then there's this notion of sense making, and that comes from Durbin, which comes out of library science originally, and also Snowden. There's another guy whose name I can't quite remember who also does it, but in a different way. I don't think I'm going to get to the transformative learning theories in this short process, but that's to do with what arose out of the participatory processes. There was something else we needed to make sense of and to understand how we might learn complexity better in a participatory process for better outcomes. But that I'll probably get to leave that today, and I'll stick with the hardcore stuff. Okay, so as I said, it's a very different type of use of narrative. It's naturalistic. We spent a lot of time trying to, and when I say we, it was a collaborative process to get the signification framework happening. A lot of time in getting the questions right and attributes and parameters right, or what we felt was right about what we wanted to know about. So this last little tale is really a snippet, an entomologist's little tale in the data. It was his first place. He couldn't wait to explore the insect life in his own backyard, but the real estate agent wouldn't let him mow the grass. So he will then signify that story to particular parameters. So the participants, the contributors, are making their own meaning. This is disintermediated. The researcher is not breaking apart the narratives to make sense of them. The narratives are there just really as exemplars of the aggregated pattern. So when we've got hundreds, thousands of people, in this case we only had 233, but when you've got thousands of people self-signifying their own tale or their own anecdote, you get some really interesting patterns emerging and the capacity for modelling. Right, a few key concepts. Ambiguity. You actually need to build in ambiguity into this framework to allow it to be loose enough, ambiguous enough for all sorts of people to signify their experience to it. And we'll see this in a minute. Heuristics, as I said, multiple types. There's the aggregated visuals, which we'll see in a minute, but then there's also the participatory processes of extracted issues and constructed archetypes. And because I'm an old radical, it's this notion of subsidiaritarianism, which is related to participatory action research. It's about devolving the planning process as close as possible to the level of the scale of the cohorts who are impacted or, subject. This is one part of the signification framework. We collect a lot of demographic data, but we also collect a lot of data where we ask them to tell us what was their feeling when they were telling the story. What was the story primarily about or secondarily about? So that way we've got the spatial. Oh God. So you can see there's lots of interdependencies there. All the green dots here are private rental sector tales. The other ones are a little bit of community sector. So this is really just a screenshot from the software. You can do dynamic queries, but you can also do Boolean queries. I don't really know what that means. I'm a statistics-free zone. But you've got the capacity with this software to do all sorts of different levels. So, for example, I could take all the private rental system stories, factor in the number of moves in 5 years, then break that down as to whether they were real estate stories or they were private landlord stories. So then we start to get the fractals of the system, or not, as the case may be. Okay, so this is what renters reckon the system is like for them. Pretty unbalanced. I'm just going to keep going forward. This is kind of like the process map. Participatory processes where we extracted data and came up with complex domain issues. So we've got people to map system issues that they had extracted into the Kinnipan framework. This is really useful because it's, as an ontological framework, it really just sort of helps us, define what the issue is. The other day when Philip was talking about managed, yes, things have been managed for long enough to now be complicated, but things probably started in the complex domain. And when they're complex with all those different interrelationships, you need to actually get to experiments to see what might work. So here were 3 complex issues and change statements. This was a bunch of policymakers. Rental churn, so we wanted the change statement was to improve stability and security. There was a contradiction between home and investment in Australia, which is not a pretty story. And then there's this lack of respect and a cultural bias. So, renters don't really have a right to do much in a rental property. They can't hang a painting, they can't, paint a wall. So we aimed for multiple experimental responses with particular criteria. They need to be safe to fail, which means that you can have multiple experiments running at once. Short time frames, evaluate, and if they're useful, then you can continue to use that as an attractor for change in the system. And then in terms of evaluating that in an ongoing way, you can do that another time down the track using the same process. And then what you're looking at is the changes in patterns. So, cultural change experiments for improved outcomes for renters was kind of the long strategic goal here. I don't know if the workshop had any impact on the policymakers who were in the midst of a strategic process. We'll find out. But some of the things that they came up with, which was similar to Sharon's students actually, but it was an app to disrupt the real estate sector and just connect the renters to the landlords. And so I'm a renter who wants a 3-year lease. I don't want to have to move after 6 months, which is the norm in Australia. So I can find someone who is prepared to give me that 3-year lease. Okay. Again, these are some of the action research cycles. And I won't go there because I didn't go there. So these are some of the examples of experiments that came up. transformative learning processes is a whole other thing that, that's in the paper that I haven't got to here. Boy, that was a quick run through, sorry. I'll leave it there.
Then we have a commentator where please.
Okay, so thank you. And for the paper, it was so interesting, and you spoke before, so it was really, I found it very inspiring and relevant for my work personally. And I had so many questions, and I won't take it from time. So I will narrow myself to one comment and one question. The comment would be on the importance of personal stories, because they are so authentic. And because people do not have to consider the general situations, they just tell you the personal story. And then after you have enough stories and things are starting to go overlapping on each other, then you can actually know what is important for this specific community and what are the main weaknesses, what are the main strengths, where do they look for solutions themselves. So everything we spoke about in this book is actually in very personal stories.
Yes.
And I might say that technology is in many cases very useful. We're actually using apps now. Using apps. People are making their personal stories. I'm used to make my grocery. I'm going here to make the shopping, and here my daughter is playing with her friends, and it's informal settlement, so they're mapping it.
Yeah.
Personally.
You can do that through this.
Yeah, I'm just I'm just commenting. So yes, and then when you have this app doing it, the stories, the overlapping, then okay, all of a sudden we just have the map of the informal settlement. So that's for that, but that's just a point. My question would be about this process of learning and about this notion of action research. We were talking about smart cities. And we were talking about smart cities as cities that can learn themselves, that can learn from their own processes.
Yeah.
And you were actually referring to the gap. It's not in your presentation, it is in the paper. To the gap between theory and practice.
Yeah.
And the fact that we are all sitting here now, and most of us are not practitioners, and we have those marvelous ideas, and we share with each other, and now we are all much smarter than we did yesterday, or much smarter than we did the day before. But then we go back home, and Greece is still Greece, or Italy is still Italy, and Israel is definitely still Israel. Nobody is going to know any of that.
Yeah.
And we just circulate among ourselves without really taking it out to the field. So I wonder if you have some...
Yeah, but this was just a PhD process, and it was in a very contested time and space. So it didn't operate as a true participatory action research project in that we had the same group of people coming back together at each cycle. Yeah, but so normally in action research, and participatory action research more so, the researcher is with the cohort and you kind of moving through learning, doing, planning, acting, reflecting, all together throughout the process. That said, I've heard so many little threads that could be called action research over the past few days. I think it's really about making learning and coming to learn an explicit part of whatever process you're involved in. And so, okay, we do this, we evaluate, but when do we actually sit down as researchers, cohort together, or a team, and reflect on the learning that we're pulling out of what we're doing? It's not common. It's common in the disciplines I've worked in organisational development and in education, but not so, it's even common in engineering, actually, believe it or not. Well, because it's a technical process there, they need to get it right. So IT and engineering know a fair bit about action research and action learning. But planners not so much. We had one minute back in the 70s and 80s with Argus and Donald Schoen, who worked with a reflective practitioner. and everybody went and bought it, and it's still on the reading lists, but it's not something that anyone has really taken up with any great gusto, in planning from what I can see. And my view is very small. You know. But that's why I was interested to kind of have the conversation between the two practices again. You know, planning practice, action research practice. In action research, you know, the theory and the practice goes absolutely hand in hand. You know, it's like that. You really can't separate them. You know, there are some wonderful philosophers who talk about when theory did get separated from practice, you know, back in the day. But I think it's something that action research is one of those fields that we can learn from as planners, because, you know, they've stuck with it.
Yeah, that's why I was.
I just want to make a point here. We've got a pattern here on challenge security. So this is attitude management, dwelling safety, rental conditions, and you know, like 77% of it was over here. With the software, it's easy enough to just pull out one of those green dots, and I've got the story there that exemplifies what that pattern's about. So that's kind of the major use of the narratives.
Okay, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it was a bit of also reaction to your discussion with Yara. But first of all, I really liked your presentation, and especially because there were two things in it that you just mentioned very briefly, but are very much in my attention as well for the research as well, and those are the archetypes.
Archetypes, yes.
And improvisation techniques.
Yes,
we discussed that for 5 seconds yesterday evening, and I think we should have started that at the beginning of the conference. But yes, but it's really great. And somehow my brief question is, how can we learn to learn, or how can we? I mean, we can use that as both archetypes and improvisation techniques as a way to research, but how can we make people also, able to work with that as a technique for exploring? So not just for us researchers to, figure out what's going on here and how can we understand that, but how can we, or can we learn people to learn with those kinds of methods?
Well, we can, and it goes somewhat to what Hans was saying in his last session, and it's about questioning and posing the problem rather than asking a question to get to a solution. And this goes back to the South American Paulo Freire, who kind of was the father of modern radical education. When you pose the question, and sit with the question, stuff will emerge out of that sitting with. You don't actually have to rush to an answer. It can be a mysterious process. But there are, in transformative learning theories and practice, there are particular methods around a critical self-reflection on assumptions, and you can set yourself up in the paper. Actually, I've set a set of questions that if I'd running the process again, I would have the policymakers reflect on, because, in that process, a lot of subjectivities came into the frame, and it was a bit shocking to me, actually, and I realised that, well, of course they do. And then the research, the tail end of the research became about, well, what kind of processes and what kinds of educational interventions can we facilitate as planners, whatever kind of planner we are. I'm not quite sure what kind of planner I am, really. But it's about it's about the facilitative skills then, and coming to support others' learning. If you're interested in that stuff, it's well worth reading the second part of the paper, because I outline some of that quite well. But it comes back to, and this is why I like action research as a field, and the practitioners and scholars in that field. they come with an attitude of inquiry. Now, we all do, we're researchers, but there's another kind of quality to that. And it actually entails us stepping back from ourselves and just being with what's ever in front of us. And that's a deep personal learning process, actually.
Okay, a couple of minutes to someone else. Any questions or comments? Oh,
Have you looked at developmental evaluation and looked at that with a comparison with regards to action research, and what do you think about
Well,
that?
I just regard developmental evaluation as a part of action research.
Right.
Patton's an action researcher.
Yeah. Okay. That would agree. Because it's huge now in the complexity field with regards to the Evaluation Association in the American.
Well, and thanks for asking that question, because really, you know, with this kind of, with these sorts of tools and processes, and I'll be making a pitch to a few kind of, you know, residential tenancy authorities when I get back to Australia, that this is a kind of a process of developing the sector, as well as, you know, when I say sector development, it's about the people in the sector and the practices in the sector. You know, there's some really cruddy practices that go on in the Australian rental system, really quite unfair, where you've got 22-year-old, you know, people who probably still live at home and get their washing done by their mother, come in and you know, make decisions about whether someone can stay in their house relative to their housekeeping. You know, it's a bit over the top. But this sort of process used in an evaluative way over a period of time, you know, you could really just kind of set this up and then each year run it. You know, open it up. It was very difficult to get to the renters. The Real Estate Institute basically gatekeeped, and so I didn't get the data levels I wanted. But that's power in the system. But if this sort of process was being used by a government authority as an evaluated tool year in, year out, then you'd get a decent sense. And mind you, it's not just about renters, you know. You run another one and gear it towards the bad behaviours of the renters. You know. Anyway.
okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
And then we have one more presentation to go. Christina.